I'm Eva Hagberg, author of When Arrow Met His Match, Aline Luchem Saarinen and the Making of an Architect, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Nowhere in the world celebrates modernism better than Palm Springs, California. It's the home of Modernism Week, a week-long architecture and design festival that actually lasts 11 days. Again this year, U.S. Modernist Radio was there, speaking with nearly all of Modernism Week's keynote speakers plus special guests. Most of them joined us poolside at the U.S. Modernist compound, the retro Hotel Skylark on North Palm Canyon Drive in Palm Springs. If you're into mid-century modern, Modernism Week is the Final Four Stanley Cup World Series of modernism. Besides stunning mid-century architecture, there's cool lectures, martinis, shopping, movie premieres, house parties, and much more. And today we also have a very special musical guest joining us by phone from Arizona, Toni Tennille, talking about her upcoming lead role in Hello, Dolly. And our last few minutes with Louisa Whitmore as she moves on to college and bigger podcasts than us, which is pretty much all podcasts. I'm Tom Guild. I've been on a whole lot of bus tours in my day. But one of the best bus tours I've ever seen is the one we do every year with Trevor O'Donnell. There's a reason he's number one on TripAdvisor's list of Palm Springs guides. Trevor is an incredible storyteller. He loves modernism, and he knows the homes and the stories of Palm Springs better than anyone. It's almost impossible to get a ticket for Trevor's bus tours during Mod Week, but we book Trevor for our own special bus tour for U.S. Modernist every year. And now, fresh from diving into the U.S. Modernist archives, here's your host, George Smart.
I know we've got a lot of you out there who've been listening to U.S. Modernist Radio for years. We're into our 8th year now. Mm-hmm. But you may not have visited the actual website, usmodernist.org. There you can find documentation on about 15,000 different houses all around the country, every Wright, every Neutra, every Lautner, every Schindler, every Soriano, and about 80 more. Plus, you can dive into our architecture magazine library, where there are over 4 million pages of architecture magazines going back into the late 1800s. It's all free, it's all accessible, it's all text searchable. So if you're looking for that funny place that you grew up next to, or a house that your grandparents had, or anything else you're trying to remember.
Or the house I grew up in.
Right, Tom's house is on there.
Yeah.
If you'd like to join us in Palm Springs for Modernism Week 2023, please email me at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by Modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In our make-believe world, modernist realtor Angela Roll grew up in Switzerland, the daughter of a hacker wrongly accused for spying for the Russians. It was actually the Albanians, who were totally killing it with a Commodore 64 and a 300-baud acoustic coupler modem.
Fast.
An Olympic-level skier, she skied into France, by mistake, flying off a mountain, then somersaulting, onto the roof of a power plant where a young Danish boy got a great idea. At 18, following an incident in the Eiffel Tower involving a wood-turning lathe, Cristal champagne, and a rousing disagreement with Karl Lagerfeld over the definition of mauve, Angela studied architecture by day and sold real estate at night, using her architecture training to connect people with the modernist homes of her dreams. Now she's one of the most knowledgeable agents and one of the only ones with her own wood-turning lathe. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL, or call 919-995-0550. Colin Flavin, founder of Flavin Architects, has been building modern houses in New England for more than 30 years. An avid sketch artist and an MIT grad, Colin was part of a Modernism Week 2022 forum highlighting East Coast modernist residential architecture and its impact on community design. Here's George with Colin Flavin, poolside in Palm Springs.
So, Colin, a question I'm sure you get asked all the time. Which is better, West Coast party, East Coast party?
I tend to go with West Coast.
West Coast? Why?
Yeah, so George, I'm originally from California.
Okay.
In fact, my speaking partner, Katie Flynn, also. Born and raised in San Francisco. I only went east to go to architectural school. I never planned to stay. I fell in love. I started my practice, and I got ensnared on the East Coast. So I've always loved coming back out west to my roots, and particularly Palm Springs for the past 10 years to see Modernism Week.
Oh, you've been here for 10 years
10
for this?
years, yes.
Oh, wow.
When it was quite a bit smaller event, actually, but have loved it.
Now, in the early days, what was it like?
Well, I was passing through on my way to Joshua Tree. I'd never even heard of it, and came by a random beautiful, beautiful house and walked in, and I was just astounded by how beautifully the culture here, the appreciation for mid-century architecture, and not just the intellectuals, but the average person. So there's a line of people out front of this house, and I got a fantastic tour, and I was sold. I've been back, every single year since
Every
then.
single year?
Yeah.
So what are some of your favorite experiences to do over and over again when you come?
Well, one of my favorites is the Albright Frey House, too.
Mine, too.
Yeah, and there's a wonderful, he did these sort of Corbusier-like concrete benches, sort of like chaises that you can lay back, and two of them face the mountain. And my favorite thing to do is to go there and spend about 2 hours with a friend and just watch the sun move across the sky.
Oh, man, that's exactly what I like, too. I love that little bench.
Yeah.
It's superb.
To me, it's the kind of greatest distillation of kind of European modernism meeting California modernism. And I think he pulled so many things together so well.
So tell our listeners about the Frey House, too, as a description.
Yeah, the Frey House, too, is set on the mountainside here in Palm Springs. It's in a field of giant boulders. And Frey, in terms of his design process, he went up there and he spent a couple of months sort of laying out the site, but he chose not to move most of the boulders. So he incorporated these giant multi-ton boulders into part of the architecture. And I think that's what makes it so wonderful. And he designs this very light structure that sort of hovers over the top of these boulders. And even the glass of the wall is kind of connected down into the rock with very little change to the boulder.
It's what, about 800 square feet, maybe?
I would think at most. It's really a very simple pavilion. And one of the things I always like to think about, it's often said that architects, their best work is a single room project. You think of really Philip Johnson's Glass House. This is very much along those lines of it's just a super simple but very elegant.
And there's a little pool.
There's a pool.
And there's something like a garage. It's more like a tiny carport you could pull a car through.
Yeah, there's a wonderful,
below.
the entry sequence is wonderful. There's a little cowbell, I guess, that came from Switzerland, that he was originally Swiss, that one would ring upon approaching the pool. The pool was a full level up from the parking. So as he loved to apparently swim in the nude, this was a way for his guests to let him know to throw on a towel.
To suit up.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And people can see this house during Modernism Week by signing up for one of the tours through the Palm Springs Museum of Art, which owns it now.
Yes. And they, by the way, are also, I believe, going to build the Luminaire House on the grounds of the museum.
Eventually. Eventually.
So, yeah.
The Luminaire House is a house that was constructed as a demonstration house in the 1930s. It was wildly popular. Tens of thousands of people saw it. It was taken apart and put back together a couple times and is now, as of this summer, sitting in a truck waiting to be put back together.
Exactly. And the story behind the Luminaire House, I think, is really interesting. Frey came from Switzerland, and he immigrated to the United States in the late 1920s. But he stopped in Paris for about 6 months, and he worked for Le Corbusier, the famous Swiss-French architect. And he learned a lot, and he brought some of those lessons, and those are in the Luminaire House, some of Corbusier's 5 points of architecture. So he's still, at the time of the Luminaire House, before he comes to the West Coast, he's still very much that East Coast more international style architect. But of course, when he comes west, he's so moved by the desert, by the simple forms of the desert, the plants. And of course, he loved the mountains, as that related back to his native Switzerland.
Well, we know now that you like the West Coast parties, but tell us about East Coast and West Coast modernism and some of the differences and similarities there.
If we start in sort of early 20s, the East Coast was very much dominated by the international style of architecture that came from Walter Gropius when he came to Harvard in the 1930s. So it was very much of a more severe, geometric type of approach to design. That's where kind of the East Coast comes from. On the West Coast, it was very different. It was sort of a native outgrowth of the arts and crafts movement influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. So it was much more organic, connected to land, indoor out. So you had these sort of polar approaches to modernism. And I think that's sort of the root of the, if you will, the rivalry.
Of the difference,
of the
right?
rivalry between
Right.
the East Coast and the West Coast.
And amidst this Super Bowl matchup of styles, where was Frank Lloyd Wright in all this?
Well, I think by many historians would call him sort of the originator of modernism. Of course, his early drawings, the Wasmuth portfolio that was widely seen in Europe, influenced the early international style architects there in the 20s. But Frank Lloyd Wright is much more associated with the West Coast, the arts and crafts, the connection to site. International style, going back to the East Coast again, is much more not site-specific. Come up with a concept for architecture that could be applied to any site.
I don't know if you've seen this or not, but there was a famous article in House Beautiful in the 50s. Elizabeth Gordon was the editor, where she came out and just excoriated modernism as being evil and communist and was going to devalue America, and all these European architects were destroying the country. And then not long after that, they published pictures of her sitting down with Frank Lloyd Wright, who sort of echoes her sentiments because he didn't like the New York crowd.
That's right. That's right. And one of the earlier architects here in California that's really important to mention, although it doesn't have anything in Palm Springs, is it's not Neutra. It is
Schindler?
Schindler. Yes. So Schindler had worked for Frank Lloyd Wright quite extensively here in Southern California, and he did his King's Roadhouse in the 1920s, which is exceptionally modern in every sense. It's got indoor, outdoor. There are outdoor rooms with fireplaces in them. It's a two-family residence. It's just a fascinating house. And I think that's very much the more organic California approach.
Okay.
Now, and it's interesting, he was not included, or rather he was excluded from the International Style exhibit in New York. And I
The
think
famous one in the 30s by Philip Johnson.
Yeah, and now Wright did make it in, but it was really more about the Gropiuses of the world and the Le Corbusiers of the world than it was Frank Lloyd Wright. He was included, but his work did not really fit in with that exhibit, I don't think.
Huh. I'd always heard that Wright was excluded for some reason, or that he was kind of added at the last minute.
It may have been the last
I don't know what the real story is. We'll have to look that up.
Mm-hmm. The story I've heard is that Philip Johnson, who was one of the curators of this exhibit, international style,
the main mover over there.
and he coined the term international style as well, along with Henry Russell Hitchcock. They were the two, kind of people organizing the show. There's this funny story about Johnson visiting Schindler in his house, and he complained that Schindler was a very bad housekeeper. Didn't think he could quite, get to that European
measure up,
level.
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. In terms of today with modernism styles, are there still differences between the two, or have they merged across the country now?
Well, I think that the West Coast style of indoor out, the connection is always going to work better in a more benign climate. There's never going to be a doubt. So if we look at any of Frey houses that have these sliding glass doors that just completely open up the side of the house, that's really not practical most of the year on the East Coast.
In Minnesota, yeah.
In Minnesota. And certainly not in New England, where I'm from.
Right.
So that sort of indoor-outdoor connection, that connection to nature, is much more literal here in California than what would make sense on the East Coast. And I think we certainly, we would copy the West Coast style on the East Coast at our own peril. There's so many energy considerations, comfort, And just the reality, we have insects, we have humidity. There really aren't that many days of the year where you want to just throw the house open.
Right, right. Harvard was, of course, a great center for the spread of modernism throughout the early 20th century. What about other schools across the country? Where were they influencing architects of the future?
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up. William Worcester, who is a early California modernist, going back to the 20s, he was teaching at Berkeley in the 40s, and he wound up getting a job at MIT to teach and actually become the dean of MIT School of Architecture in the mid-40s. So he was the originator of this the modern ranch house style. And when he came to MIT in the 40s, he brought that with him. And many architects on the East Coast felt that he was a major influence in bringing that more West Coast vibe to the East Coast.
And what about other schools in the country? Like, was there a center in the Midwest or the South, or?
That's a great question. Certainly, there are great schools throughout the country, but I always think those two poles, East and West Coast.
Berkeley and MIT, or Berkeley and Harvard?
Berkeley and Harvard, really. I think Harvard was much more in an international style. MIT was kind of off doing its own thing, and I think, again, influenced when Worcester came east.
What are some of the houses that you really love to visit on the East Coast?
Oh, well, I always enjoy the Gropius house. So Walter Gropius' own house is built in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and is now beautifully preserved. It's just like he left the house earlier this morning.
This isn't a little neighborhood of modernist houses, correct?
It is. And it's really kind of a wonderful story behind the house. As Walter Gropius, he had just come, he escaped the Nazis, he had landed a good position teaching at Harvard, and he was at a dinner party and seated next to a philanthropist, Helen Starrow. Starrow was just enamored with his tales of modernism and the ideas for the future. She gave him a piece of land that she owned in Lincoln on which to build this house, and extended him a loan to build it. So he really connected well, and I think people really responded to this. So the house, I like, it picks up so many aspects of the New England vernacular that is just quite interesting. It's a simple two-story box. It has a center entrance like a typical New England colonial, and it's a compact form that makes sense in our climate. As you know, many of the modernist houses here in Palm Springs are long and linear and are great about ventilation. But in New England, we need a more compact floor plan.
We had the granddaughter of Gropius on the show a couple of years ago.
Oh, great, yeah.
And she was telling me when we were chatting before the interview that there was this song that Tom Lehrer had recorded in the 60s about Gropius. And we looked it up.
Interesting.
And actually found Tom Lehrer, the comedian who was 94 at the time, and he let us play the song on the show.
That's great.
Gropius was married to this European woman who had a series of very famous husbands.
Is that right?
Yes. One was Gustav Mahler, and I can't remember the third one, but it's a hilarious little song. Tom would write these satirical pieces, and he would go in front of concert halls and play, and did that for about 10 years. He had huge album sales. But he was also a mathematician at heart, and he retired from all that and taught math the rest of his career.
Yeah, it's interesting. Gropius was a great teacher, great founder of the Bauhaus School of Architecture in Germany. There's some debate to what extent he was actually an architect in terms of drawing things. And he tended to have a assistant by his side, and he would sort of direct the assistant to draw the way, quite unable to draw, apparently. It's interesting.
I guess at some point it doesn't matter, does it? Really?
Yeah. And at some point there's a question as to whether it was Marcel Breuer who had come at Gropius's invitation to the Boston area, whether he was really the primary architect of Gropius's own house.
Now, your practice is in Boston now?
Yes.
And how's Boston preservation going?
It's picking up steam. I think 10 years ago, when I first was coming here, I think I was just shocked to the extent to which modern architecture, the recent modern architecture, is appreciated by the general public. We really have not had that. But it's really picked up. There's much more interest in modern architecture. So my practice has now been quite involved in restoring some of the really great mid-century modern houses of the Boston suburbs. And you mentioned Lincoln. Definitely Lincoln is kind of a hotbed of mid-century modern houses. We've restored a number of them. And I find that clients who often initially look at the house with the idea, well, we're going to need to expand. There's no way we can settle for an 11-foot by 13-foot primary bedroom.
Yeah.
When they get in the house and with the right renovation, it can be intimate and a wonderful home. So I've really appreciated playing some small part in helping restore some of these houses and stabilize them, keep them for the future.
Keep them going.
You know, one of the things, George, that I'm very passionate about is what lessons are relevant from mid-century. And one of them is a smaller house size, but also a house that is more intimate in terms of the connection between family members. So bedrooms are small, but common areas take up most of the house. So there's a natural tendency to come into the common areas. And it's something I think is lost in a lot of these mega houses that I think
there are some
today.
mega houses. You know, in LA, they're building such monster homes now that I really start to think of them as like mini hotels, because some of them are selling, but some of them are not. And eventually, some entrepreneur is going to figure out, I could buy this place, get it rezoned, right, and have this beautiful, super modern boutique hotel.
Yeah, it's hard to understand how those houses could possibly make sense. But
They do.
they make sense to someone, for sure.
Let's go back to Boston. There are two buildings there that people love to hate, the Boston Government Center downtown and the Paul Rudolph Center, which are similar large concrete buildings. What's happening with those lately?
Well, there was a plan. So you're talking about two separate buildings. One
Yeah.
is the City Hall building, was designed by Coleman, McKinnon & Wood. And then, of course, there is the Paul Rudolph designed Lindemann Center.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back. Let's start with the City Hall. City Hall, our former mayor, Menino, had proposed to move City Hall to another part of the city and to designate this as a potential development site, likely to take the building down. That's now been dropped, I think, and the current plan, I think, is to keep City Hall.
Okay.
It's got to be one of the most extraordinarily well-crafted monuments, brutalist monuments of that period, and we hope it's kept. Government Center by Rudolph is a little bit different. It's likely that a portion of it is going to be radically changed.
Okay.
There are actually two. It's a mega building. It looks like a single structure. There's actually two structures, and one of them is considered to be less kind of important. And so it's being likely sold to a developer in a bidding process. I think in the end of the day, it will be, sensitively done.
What do people dislike so much about these buildings? Because there's a lot of vitriol about these structures.
To be fair, concrete does not look as good in New England, in Boston, than it does in the West Coast. If we take Kahn Salk Institute with that magnificent concrete on the ocean in a relatively dry climate, it's just lovely. In Boston, it tends to get moldy, it's grayish, and frankly, the buildings have not been well maintained. So
no surprise there. A lot of city buildings across the country are not well maintained.
It's really unfortunate.
I've also heard that they leak. Is that true, or is that just a rumor by people who hate them?
I'm not aware that either of those buildings have that type of issue. Now, these giant concrete structures tend to be energy inefficient, and that's always a challenge. They are difficult to maintain. They're expensive to maintain. But I think there's a place for them. They're such an important part of an era it's a past era in Boston that we no longer have, was the era of renewal, urban renewal. And these are, frankly, two of the kind of most important and magnificent buildings that one could imagine. Certainly, I think we should keep them in the context of just the history. Not that we want to repeat that sort of whole-scale destruction of neighborhoods, but I think they're beautifully done. And I think they also represent a type of architecture that could no longer be done. The vast energy use that's required for these concrete structures, I don't think makes sense any longer. But I think it does make sense to hold on to that as sort of a memory of a different era.
Is there any way to mitigate that particular energy use? Like, can they put a little nuclear reactor on the roof, or 1,000 solar panels, or anything to make this better?
Well, George, the The energy use is really in the making of the building in the first place.
Okay.
So it's the embodied energy with concrete that's the challenge. There's certainly plenty of things they can do to reduce the amount of energy use going forward. And
Right.
like you said, insulation is certainly one approach. Although this building is very challenging, the Rudolph building, because the concrete is a continuous pour. So the concrete wall creates your inside wall and your outside wall.
Okay.
So, and thermally, it doesn't perform well.
Like an old castle, really.
Exactly.
Yeah?
Exactly. In a damp and cold climate.
Yeah.
Not always the most pleasant thing.
Those English lords were always complaining about their damp castles. I suspect that would be similar.
Yeah, I think so.
So what's next for you here in Palm Springs? What are you going to go see next?
Well, actually, I'm going to L.A. to see Neutra's VDL house.
Wonderful.
So it's the 90th anniversary of the house, and I think very relevant to today because the house is a live workspace. It had room for 2 families and, of course, Neutra's architectural firm. It was also an experimental house that Neutra tried all kinds of different ideas around sun louvers, really interesting ideas about how do we connect to nature. So there are upper terraces with like small ponds and plants. So I'm really anxious to, on the 90th anniversary of this building, kind of tell a story about how it connects to things that are so important in our world today.
This is a great place to visit. And in addition, we've heard news out here in Palm Springs that to say this nicely, the ugly-ass fence around Silver Lake is supposedly going to be taken down.
Well, I don't know about this.
There's been a fence up around it for years and years, and they're starting to work on improving the whole look and feel of that site. And the VDL house is right on Silver Lake. So it's just a gorgeous location. And there are all kinds of Neutra buildings and houses in the area. This was called the Neutra Colony for a while, for the dozen or so houses that are near the VDL or nearby. And on the other side of the lake, up the hill, there's just house after house after house by Lautner and Schindler and Neutra and everybody who was building in that area at the time.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time at Schindler's Kings Road house, which is one of my favorite, all the way back to my college years. And over the years, it's been restored to a large extent. Really one of the most extraordinary works of architecture. Of course, Schindler and Neutra were big rivals.
Yes.
Schindler invited Neutra to come over to join him in practice here, and it really did not work well together. But it's fascinating to see both of their work kind of nestled in together.
Well, Colin, thanks so much for coming and talking with me. This has been fun.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
That was our conversation with Colin Flavin in Palm Springs. Minoru Yamasaki came to fame through the Lambert-St. Louis airport, but his most heralded creation was the original World Trade Center in New York City. That project landed him on the cover of Time magazine. The World Trade Center's twin towers were the tallest office buildings in the world at the time, at 110 stories tall. In a career spanning 3 decades, Yamazaki and his Michigan-based firm designed over 250 buildings. He died in 1986, and his firm continued until closing in 2009. We got to talk with artist and writer Justin Beal, who went to Yale and USC, and his art is included in the permanent collections of the Albright Knox Museum, the Hammer Museum, and the LA Museum of Contemporary Art. Now a professor at Hunter College, Justin's most recent project is Sandfuture, a look at the life and work of Minoru Yamasaki. Here's our conversation, recorded poolside at the U.S. Modernist compound in Palm Springs. Justin, when I heard about your book, Sandfuture, I thought it was a sequel to Dune. But it's not.
No, the title is meant to sort of engineer to confuse, but so I'm glad it was successful in that right.
I was imagining like worms and planets and stuff, but tell us what it's about.
It's a book about the American architect Minoru Yamasaki, but it's also a book about me and some of the thing, my life in the last 5 years. So part of it is partially memoir. I don't like that term, but it is what it is. And then the other half is something close to biography, which is also not a term that I particularly embrace because I don't feel qualified to have written a biography or a memoir. But
Is it a
but
book?
Here I am. I did. It is a book.
It's a book.
It is
Okay.
certainly a book.
You will embrace that.
Yeah, I will own that part of it. Yeah. So
We've established, ladies and gentlemen, that he has written a book.
I have written a book, indeed. It's it's quite experimental in its form because it moves between the story of Yamasaki and this other kind of more contemporary story.
I think there was do you remember, Tom, Sherman's March?
Yeah.
That was the book that the guy wrote about Sherman's march through the South. But every other chapter was about him trying to get back together with his girlfriend.
I do remember that,
it's
where
similar.
It's a bit like that.
where there are parallel storylines that eventually intersect.
Right. But at least in that case, the title tells you what the book is about.
Right.
He's got that one on me.
Okay, so what's with sand?
Well, the book was published by the MIT Press, so it kind of it was published in this very academic context. It's a very rigorously researched book, but it's not an academic book in the traditional sense of what you might expect from an academic publisher. And it was important to me to signal something in the title to the reader that they were encountering something that, though it was published by an academic press, was not their typical academic book. And the easiest way to do that was to deviate from this sort of structure of the academic title.
Right.
It's like, this is the subject of the book, colon, this is the thesis of the book.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And
The colon is the giveaway.
the colon is always the
Right.
giveaway.
And there's no credit for finishing the book. You don't get
Right.
4 hours course credit.
Exactly. So I wanted it to immediately appear to be something different. And we achieved that through design. It's sort of the shape of a novel. Mm-hmm. It's easy to read. It doesn't have too many words on the page, right? So it doesn't feel like a punitive experience. And it was important to have this title that would somehow communicate that. But that's not really answering the question. The word Sandfuture actually came, my daughter, who's a character in the book, who is 7 now, was 3 at the time I wrote it, at one point asked me, totally unrelated to the book, she was looking for an hourglass that was part of a board game. And she's like, Dad, have you seen this Sandfuture, right? So it's her word for an hourglass. And I'm really an artist. This is my first book, and I've always been terrible at titling. I have made hundreds of artworks that are titled Untitled, which is archivally a disaster. But I needed some kind of title to put on the top of the manuscript.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I just used her word Sandfuture as a placeholder.
That's her
of
word
sorts.
for an hourglass.
And then the book kind of grew around it, and there was this image on the cover of the book, which is this expanse of sand on what's now Battery Park City. The Hurricane Sandy played a very central role. So in a weird way, the book kind of grew into the title, and there we were at the end. It was a bit of a fight with MIT to let that be the title, because they asked again and again, how are people going to know what the book is about?
Yeah.
Which...
Well, I
To
think
which I
that's,
can say,
that's a lovely story about your daughter.
Sure. And also
Yeah.
people have been, how would you know what?
yeah. At my house, when my wife wants TV remotes, can I have the upper downer?
There you go. Yeah. See?
Yeah.
That's a good one, too.
People have a lot of different names for
They
that
do.
object, don't they?
Yeah.
The shooter is in our house.
The clicker.
Give me the shooter.
Yeah.
Yamasaki is so integrated in some of the most memorable buildings of our time, yet he hasn't really been as celebrated as so many other architects.
True. In a sense, this book began 20 years ago. I studied architecture as an undergraduate. I never really practiced architecture, but I studied architecture as an undergraduate, and I moved immediately after graduating from college to Lower Manhattan, and I remember just standing at the foot of the World Trade Center thinking, I mean, first of all, it was such an incredible building, and I only lived next to it for a few weeks, bad timing, but being struck by the fact that I just finished quite a rigorous architecture program, and I had no idea who designed these two buildings. And it was sort of slowly over the last 2 decades, I connected Yamasaki to the World Trade Center, then also to images of Period Igo, which I had, of course, seen, but nobody had told me who designed the building, to the Eastern Airlines terminal at Logan Airport in Boston, where I grew up.
Oh, I didn't realize he did that one.
Yeah, to Century City in Los Angeles, to Robertson Hall at Princeton. And I started to realize the magnitude of this body of work. And that was part of my initial curiosity in researching him, was how was this a figure who was totally excluded from my architectural education despite his enormous contribution to American architecture.
One clue might be his name.
True. Although that's a big part of the issue. But I think there's also other things that are more complicated even than race that have to do with class, geography, his relationship to ornament, right? He was doing all these things that were against the grain of sort of mainstream modernism. And so absolutely it was a completely homogenous white male profession at the time that he was practicing. But it was also, he also embraced decoration in a way that was sort of anathema to his peers. He was working in Detroit rather than on the coast. And he was also kind of a self-made man. He wasn't sort of coming from this position of privilege. And so I think all of those things contribute to his kind of obscurity. And one of the most complicated things in writing about him is sort of pulling apart the fact that he's best known for these two projects, Pruitt-Igoe and the World Trade Center, that both were demolished quite spectacularly on television.
That's true.
Which is incredible.
Pruitt-Igoe was demolished on television?
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah, there were like legions of reporters standing around to document
this
the demolition.
Was the public housing project in St. Louis.
Yes, in St. Louis, yes. And one of the complicated things about that, that is just a spectacular coincidence in its own right. But they're also the two projects that are probably the least indicative of his work on the whole, right? So that they were both projects that had very complicated clients. It's sort of, by the time they were finished, they were quite austere, simple buildings that were not like what he was making in the rest of his practice. So, finding a balance between those two things. And that's why he can be kind of a complicated figure to place in history, but he absolutely is an important one and has been grossly overlooked.
In doing the research for your book, did you get to talk with Obata at all?
Indirectly. We have a mutual friend, so there was some dialogue there. And I also worked quite closely with Yamasaki's granddaughter, Katie, who I became really good friends with. And I looked a lot at Obata's work. And that was sort of they worked together on certain projects. And then there was kind of this shift when Yamasaki left St. Louis and focused his practice exclusively in Detroit. And Obata stayed with Helmuth in St. Louis and went on to create one of the most successful architecture firms in history. So, that's an important piece of the story for sure.
So what was Yamazaki really like? Because there are fewer and fewer people now that really knew him.
True. That's an incredibly complicated question, and one that I still don't totally feel like I have a great grasp on. He was a very private person, very driven. There's very little personal information in his archive. It's astonishingly difficult to kind of get behind the curtain. My conversations with his granddaughter, Katie, were very helpful in that regard. But he was very humble, right? Uncharacteristically so for an architect. He admitted his mistakes, which is generally not something that people in this profession tend to do readily. And really incredibly focused on his work. I think he was a complicated father at times, but very driven. This shift happened at some point in his career where you feel as though he was sort of marginalized by some of his peers who were not interested in this more decorative direction he was going in. And you can see at that point in his career that he was spending a lot of time, he was sort of identifying almost more as a businessman. He was spending time with these other businessmen in Detroit and really focused on keeping the office going. He had an incredibly diverse office, especially for the time. He was very committed to sustaining diversity in his office in a way that was way ahead of his time. This would have been in the kind of turning point in terms of the new direction in his work was in the late 50s.
Okay, you're right.
So he really started as a pretty traditional modernist, kind of in the Miesian mold. And then after the Lambert Airport in St. Louis opened, he got very sick. He had ulcers. He had to get 2/3 of his stomach removed.
Was he involved in the design of that terminal?
Yeah.
Still around for the most part.
Still around for the most part, yeah. Some windows blew out recently, but yeah. After that project and after the surgery, his doctors were urging him to take some time off, and he was working on a consulate in Kobe, and on one of those visits to Kobe, he took 6 months to travel around Asia and Europe to a certain extent, but it was really the time in India and in the Middle East that I think were the most influential. And he came back from that trip and wrote these 2 articles in Architectural Record that were really sort of defining the next chapter of his career. And it's at that point where you see this real shift in the critical reception of his work. The more traditional modernists started to question this decorative element that he was bringing into the work. And very shortly thereafter, it's also when he got the job to design the World Trade Center. So that was kind of an inflection point in his career. He was on the cover of Time magazine early in 1963, right after he got the job to design the World Trade Center. And that's the easiest point to be like, oh, there was his career before that and then his career after that.
Time used to feature architects fairly regularly. I think there were 5 or 6 of them who made it to the cover.
You consider that regular?
For architecture. For architecture.
No, I mean, what's interesting about that is I would describe the architects on the cover of Time magazine as architects who my mom knows by name, right?
Yeah.
Frank Lloyd Wright, Saarinen, Buckminster Fuller. So, yes, that's absolutely true, but still Yama was a bit of an outlier in that regard. And but it's an indication of his status in that world at that time. You know, and in the sort of late 50s, early 60s, he won more AIA awards than Saarinen's office and then SOM. I mean, he was really quite a prominent architect, and then there was sort of this decline after that had to do with a number of factors, including the World Trade Center and that critical reception of the World Trade Center.
Yeah. Why did people not like the World Trade Center? I mean, whenever I saw it as a child growing up, and then later on, it just seemed like a very fine building to me and very symbolic of New York. You know, they're always... Later on in its career, they were always heralding it as a symbol of the city.
Yeah.
But why was the initial reaction poor?
Well, and the initial reaction was not poor. It was actually quite enthusiastic. I think the simplest answer to that question is it took so long to build, right? And so if you imagine this project that he was given the job in 1962.
Oh, right.
And the building didn't actually officially open until 1973. And
so for more than a decade, it was this thing that wasn't finished.
And it was also a complicated decade. You guys know better than I, but this was
You're not saying we're old, are you?
No. That it was a decade.
We just know our history.
Exactly, right. Exactly.
I've read about it.
Yeah.
It's a decade in which the culture of this country changed in a fundamental way, and I think there was a sort of optimism about the technological achievement of building these buildings in the late 60s, but then you see these images of them there actually rising from the ground in the summer of 1969 in New York City. It's Stonewall, it's Woodstock, and I think by the time they started to go up, it was impossible not to see these two massive buildings as sort of symbols of the man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that really informed their reading. And then, of course, shortly after, by the time they were done, 73, 74, New York City was sliding into bankruptcy. And they just became also a symbol not only of the man, but of sort of bureaucratic excess and waste at a time when the city didn't need that office space. It wasn't until the 80s that they kind of really became this symbol of Wall Street and financial power of New York
Were they
City.
having trouble leasing space in the building?
Absolutely. They were losing $20 million a year.
Ouch.
Because it was, everyone was leaving the city, right? It was a time of white flight in New York City. People were moving out. And
A lot of crime.
Yeah. It was not a time, it was not a good time to be opening 10 million square feet of real estate. And the only reason they really survived that is because the government rented a lot of space to kind of bridge the gap. But by 1983, they were at almost full capacity, and the city was roaring back to life. And I like to think of that, the image of the cover of Bright Lights, Big City that has the World Trade Center in the background, and that's when they changed really from a symbol of when they were conceived as the crown jewel of the Port Authority of New York that presided over what was really a mercantile city, right? It was an industrial city based around these ports. And that idea, that sort of image of LaGuardia's image of the workers' city died with the bankruptcy in the 70s, and the city was sort of resurrected as this financial capital. What the building symbolized really shifted in a fundamental way again in the 70s.
Now, after Pruitt-Igoe and the World Trade Center, which of Yamazaki's buildings are still around that are places people could visit today?
Oh, of course. That's a good question. One of my favorites is the Rainier Tower in Seattle, which is that beautiful 40-foot skyscraper that has a little stem at the bottom.
Okay.
Which was really derided by critics at the time that it was built. Ada Louise Huxtable, who had been a great fan of Yama's work, said that it was a crime against urban nature, and that it was a building that was not so much built as perpetrated. But
Wow.
I think she had a way with words. But
Yeah,
I think it's aged very well. It's really a beautiful building. The Robertson building at Princeton, which formerly Woodrow Wilson, but he's been canceled and they changed the name back to Robertson. That's a very elegant building that's still there. There's a number of beautiful buildings in Detroit. McGregor Memorial Conference Center is a favorite of a lot of people. I also love the buildings in Century City in Los Angeles.
Now, what do we learn about you in those chapters that are not about Yamazaki?
Oh, yeah. Well,
Right.
Yeah. It's not so much what you learn about me. It's just sort of how I came to look at Yamasaki and how I came to write the book itself, so the book actually opens with Hurricane Sandy, which was in 2012. It happened at a time when I had just moved back to New York City from Los Angeles, and the woman who's now my wife, who's the character Nina in the book, owned an art gallery that was terribly flooded during the hurricane. And so I ended up spending several months really kind of salvaging all this dead artwork, much of which was made by very close friends of mine from this basement. And that happened at a point in my career as an artist where I'd been watching, things were going quite well, but I was starting to feel like the work was getting a little repetitive, and I was looking at people who were older than me and realizing that the ones that were the happiest in that sort of midpoint in their career as artists were the ones that had made a change to their practice, right? That hadn't kept doing the same thing over and over again. And it was sort of with that idea in mind that I encountered all of this work that was flooded and destroyed. And I remember thinking at the time, it just felt like such an insane way to communicate, to make sculptures and put them out in the world and have some collector buy them and then put them in a storage unit and never see the light of day again or whatever. Right. And so I'd been thinking about doing something a little bit different at the time, and that really planted the seed of this writing project. And so you mentioned actually Dale Geyer's book before, and so there's a key moment in this book where I'm about 2 years into writing this book about Yamasaki. I'm quite proud of myself for writing the first English language book about Yamasaki in 40 years.
Yeah.
And I think I'm really on to something. And a colleague of mine calls me and sort of gingerly tells me that this other guy is already writing that book, and he's a couple years ahead of me, which, as you can understand, sent me into a bit of a tailspin.
Yeah.
Maybe you can add more sex to it or something.
Yeah, right, exactly. There is more sex in my book than Dale's book,
Whoa.
but it's not saying much.
What's that? Put Fabio in the cover.
Yeah. It was at that point, after about a week of feeling completely destitute, I realized that it was actually kind of a gift, because I didn't want to write a really thorough retrospective monograph about Yamasaki. I'm not really qualified to do that. And the fact that Dale had taken on that responsibility of accounting for every project, accounting for every detail, actually allowed me to write a much weirder book, which was more like the book that I wanted to write. And that really helped me sharpen my focus, because I think what I was trying to do, and I didn't realize until that moment, was to sort of write the architecture book that I had always wanted to read and that I'd never felt was out there.
Without the burden of it also being the book.
The book, right. And so Dale's book is excellent, and it's an incredible resource for students who want to know about Yamasaki. It's a book that needs to be in every architectural library. It's important in that regard. But I think what I really wanted to write was something that was much more personal, and I think that I had felt my experience of architecture is really personal, and architecture books, by and large, tend to be quite impersonal. I think it's similar to the way in which architects always insist on photographing their buildings without people in them, which is completely insane, because who are you building the buildings for, right?
Right.
And I realized at that point that the books about architecture that I had always gravitated to the most were not the ones written by architects, but the ones that were written by people like James Salter, Donald Barthelme, or Teju Cole, or these other authors who were taking a kind of literary perspective on it. And that kind of really helped me sharpen my focus and figure out what I wanted to do, but also allowed me to bring these other things into the book, stories from my life, and to give a kind of more personal perspective on what I was writing about.
Well, Justin, thanks you for stopping by.
Of course.
It's really nice to meet you. The book is Sandfuture by Justin Beal.
Thank you.
George and I were talking about Minoru Yamasaki with Justin Beal at Mod Week in Palm Springs. If you had a pulse in 1975, you hummed or sang one song that dominated the charts and catapulted the duo behind it to national fame. I'm talking about Love Will Keep Us Together by the Captain and Tennille, the first in a series of mega hits, a TV show, a talk show, and countless concerts and appearances throughout the 1970s and 80s. The captain, Daryl Dragon, died in 2019, but we are thrilled to have with us Toni Tennille. In a career spanning 7 decades, she's worked with just about everybody in the business, including the Beach Boys, Pink Floyd, John Tesh, Smashing Pumpkins, Stone Temple Pilots, and Guns N' Roses. In her way too short-lived talk show, which you can see clips of on YouTube, she interviewed Bob Hope, Christopher Reeve, Smokey Robinson, Arsenio Hall, Barbara Eden, Jane Fonda, Charlton Heston, we assume he was unarmed, Buddy Hackett, and the great Dick Clark. She's been on some of the most iconic shows in television, like The Love Boat,
which has been rebooted this year.
And she's been on Fantasy Island. And now she's come out of retirement to play the lead in Hello, Dolly this fall in Prescott, Arizona. Welcome, Toni Tennille.
Thank you so much. It's a gorgeous day here in Prescott. It's beautiful.
Toni, before we get started, people tend to think of you as a pop singer or a jazz singer, but you got into some serious rock with Pink Floyd on the wall.
Well, yeah, but I was basically doing backgrounds for them. I got a call one day. I didn't really know who they were when I got a call from Bruce Johnston, who used to be with the Beach Boys. I think he still is. He said, look, Pink Floyd are in town and they need some background work. Are you interested? And I said, well, yeah, I'd love to. I was always interested to see I wanted to see how a rock group did their sessions and so forth. So I agreed to do it. It was Carl Wilson of the Beach Boys and myself and Bruce Johnston and the studio singer, John Joyce. And we did backgrounds for Elton John and, some other people whenever we were all in town. So it was done on a Sunday morning at a studio in LA called Producers Workshop. And I'll never forget, Daryl went with me. We walked in the front door and Dave Gilmour was there and he introduced himself and he said, oh, I'm so happy to see you. He said, I saw you on television this morning.
Oh, no.
What was he looking at Sunday morning TV that we were on? And he said, I was watching Kids Are People Too with my kids. We had guested on that little kids show. And I thought, well, there goes the rock image right out the window.
Right.
I fully expected when we went in there that I was going to see a lot of dope and groupies lying around and all that sort of, nothing like that. It was one of the most professional recording sessions I've ever experienced in my life, and I was incredibly impressed with them.
So was it just that one morning that you worked with them, or were you back a couple of other times?
No, that was the one day we got all of our work done, our background work. But then they said, as soon as we're going to perform this, I want you to come see it. Dave says, I'll get you tickets when we're doing it in L.A.
Right, because they only did it a few times, didn't they?
I know. And I'm telling you, it was brilliant in every way. But here's my favorite story about Pink Floyd. Daryl didn't want to go with me, so I went with Bruce Johnston's wife, Harriet. And we were taking our seats at this huge arena. I can't remember where they were. But there was a kid in front of me, looked like he was about 15 years old or something, and he recognized me. And he turned around and he said, what are you doing here? Honestly, that's the way he said it. I thought, boy, I'm going to have fun with this. And I said, well, I'm here as a guest of Dave Gilmour. These tickets were given to me for singing On the Wall, his current album. And he said, no, you didn't. And I said, well, yeah, my name is on the credits of the CD, I think it was CD, said.
Or the album, yeah, right.
Yeah, album. And he said, I've got a friend who's got one of those. I'm going to go look and see. And I thought, okay, fine. He went off, and a few minutes later, he came back with a completely changed attitude. And he said, would you sign my program?
Oh, that must have been sweet.
Oh, honey, it's one of my favorite memories ever. And, we always put people musicians in categories. You're pop, or you're rock, or you're a jazz singer. And I kind of can do all of that stuff, but also Daryl and I were always known as the loving couple. And I was put into kind of a straitjacket as far as songs that I wrote for us, because our fans did not want to hear any songs that had a negative romantic content to it. And I like to write all kinds of songs, whatever comes into my mind. But they would hear a song like that and they would say, "Are you all right? Is everything okay with your relationship?" It was difficult. And we were made fun of, and we just went, yeah. But Daryl and I were both well-trained classical musicians. We had a lot in us that we couldn't do as Captain and Tennille because it just wasn't expected. But, one of my great idols for as far as doing what the heck you want was Linda Ronstadt, Linda Ronstadt.
Right.
Because she's very much like me. She did, whatever music she wanted to do. And although I couldn't really get most record companies to release albums of me doing the standards, I still managed to get them out on albums. And I think that's some of the finest singing I've ever done. And so I really am kind of a jazz singer. I am a jazz singer, but I'm a pop singer. And I'm also singing classical now because I've been studying classical voice for the last 3 years. And now I'm going back on the stage to do Hello, Dolly.
This Can't Be Love premiered in 1938, written by Rodgers and Hart from a musical no one remembers called The Boys from Syracuse. The song, however, became a huge hit for Benny Goodman, Nat King Cole, Tony Bennett, Judy Garland, Ella Fitzgerald, Doris Day, Frank Sinatra, the sizzling Julie London, Diana Krall, and past podcast guest Stacey Kent. Here's Toni from her wonderful album, which all Modernist fans should have in their collection. Toni sings big band with This Can't Be Love.
This can't be love because I feel so well. No sobs, no sorrows, no sighs. This can't be love. I get no dizzy spell. My head is not in the skies. My heart does not stand still. Just hear it beat. This is too sweet to be loved. This can't be love because I feel so well, but still I love to look in your eyes. This can't be love because I feel so well. No sobs, no sorrows, no sighs. This can't be love. I get no dizzy spell. My head is not in the skies. My heart does not stand still. Just hear it beat. This is too sweet to be loved. This can't be love because I feel so well, but still my heart beats on. All cares are gone. I know that this can't be love. Hey now.
Huh, sounds just like Pink Floyd.
That was a Sammy Nestico arrangement. He was my arranger for almost all my symphony book and my big band book, and he was a fabulous man. We just lost him. He was 98 years old and working up to the very end. What a wonderful man he was.
Yeah, we should all be so lucky.
Yeah, and Rodgers and Hart, they were great.
It really is an amazing album. If you're not familiar with Hello, Dolly, it was a 1964 Broadway play that was a huge hit with Carol Channing.
Right.
Winning a 37-year record haul of 10 Tony Awards. In 1969, Barbra Streisand, who was terrific and also way too young for the role, was in the movie version. A critical success, but a financial disaster that nearly bankrupted Fox Studios and put the kibosh on movie musicals until Cabaret and Liza Minnelli came along.
Mm-hmm.
Based on Thornton Wilder's 1938 farce, The Merchant of Yonkers, Hello, Dolly follows the story of matchmaker Dolly Levi as she travels to Yonkers to find a match for the bachelor Horace Vandergelder. Of course, hilarity ensues. The movie was also the big break for Michael Crawford, who went on to play the original Phantom in
Hit it, Ringo.
Phantom of the Opera.
Oh, yeah.
So, Toni, what inspired you to come out of retirement and go for this role in Hello, Dolly?
Well, one of the reasons that Daryl and I moved here to Prescott is because it really is just a hotbed of artists, creative people, actors, singers, dancers, everything you can think of, sculptors here in Prescott. We also have a fabulous college called Yavapai College, and they have a theater arts department that's just superb. The director of the college of the theater arts there called me about 3 years ago before COVID, and said, I've got a proposition for you. You, Hello Dolly, 2021. And at this point, I had been, retired on purpose. I was enjoying myself singing, the great classical works with the master chorale and all that kind of stuff. And I was keeping very active, but I wasn't doing any more theater. So I told him I'd let him know in a week. He had to get the rights, so he had to know as soon as possible. So I called him back and I said, I'll be your Dolly. Well, then COVID came and it postponed everything. And our beautiful state-of-the-art, it's a magnificent theater at Yavapai College. State-of-the-art in every way. It seats 1,200. It has a beautiful stage, lots of fly space, wing space. It's spectacular. And I'd seen several shows done there, and I was incredibly impressed. So the money that we make for Hello Dolly, none of it is going to me. I'm getting nothing for this. I'm donating myself, and all the money goes to the theater arts department and the music department at Yavapai College for them to keep this fabulous thing that they have going. These people that I'm working with, the age range runs from 15 to late 70s. We've got great actors in this town who are mature and comic actors. We've got these great kids. I love these kids and they love me, and we're having the best time together. So every time I go to rehearsal, I just love them, and they're fabulous. They're working so hard, and we have 54 people in the cast and 3 dogs.
Oh.
The set is being built by the college where they teach set design and construction.
That's good.
And they're being designed and built right there, and they're spectacular.
Well, speaking of musicians, you're quite an accomplished pianist, even though the captain was the one playing keyboards when you were on TV most of the time.
Well, yeah. There were a lot of times that I played the lead piano because it was a different kind of piano than he played. One of my favorite songs we've ever recorded, was A Song of Joy by Billy Preston.
Uh-huh.
And just a magnificent arrangement and everything that Daryl did. But I played the piano on that and sang. And then he created everything else, the backgrounds and all that. It's a killer arrangement. We worked different ways. We both studied classical piano for about 10 years. But when we met, I kind of thought maybe we could, do some wonderful things together. He was always quirky. He was very good at finding odd little things in songs and recordings that would make people want to listen again. And it's something that would catch your ear.
Yeah, hooks.
And I've always been more conservative in the way I like to arrange things. But, then he would come in and add some really fun thing or different thing that would make it work. We worked very well together as far as music. The other stuff, not so good.
Well, this next song was written by Gene DePaul and Sammy Kahn and was recorded by the great Dinah Washington, the DeCastro sisters, George Maharis on the TV show Route 66, Al Jarreau, who you remember from the Moonlighting theme, and even Amy Winehouse back in 2003. Here's Toni with Teach Me Tonight.
Did you say I've got a lot to learn? Well, don't think I'm trying not to learn, since this is the perfect spot to learn. teach me tonight, starting with the ABC of it, right down to the XYZ of it. Help me solve the mystery of it. Teach me tonight. The sky's a blackboard high above you. Should a shooting star go by, I'll use that star to write I love you 1,000 times across the sky. One thing isn't very clear, my love. Should the teacher stand so near, my love, graduation's almost here, my love. Teach me tonight. A blackboard high above you. Should a shooting star go by, I'll use that star to write I love you 1,000 times across the sky. Oh, one thing isn't very clear, my love. Should the teacher stand so near, my love, graduation's almost here, my love. Teach me tonight. Graduation's almost here, my love. Teach me
I love this album. Toni sings big band.
Sexy, and it swings like crazy. Wow.
Yeah.
Before we go, Toni, I have to ask you, tell us about the famous night when you entertained the Queen of England, the president, and you pissed off Henry Kissinger.
Oh. What?
Oh, that's one of my favorite stories. Daryl and I were invited to perform in the East Room of the White House, along with Bob Hope, for the 1976 bicentennial celebration by President and Mrs. Ford. And Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were to be there, and the Prime Minister of England and his wife, and various other celebrities, including, Julia Child and all these people. And Henry Kissinger and his wife, I believe her name is Nancy, were right in the front row. We were only going to do about four or five numbers. And we had planned, of course, Love Will Keep Us Together to do, because that was the only hit we had at that time. And The Way I Want to Touch You, which I wrote. And that's all we had. And so I said, well, we can't do The Way I Want to Touch You. That might be a little too risque for the White House. I don't know what I was thinking. So we were in the middle of sound check, and in walks Mrs. Ford. And I'll never forget, she looked so lovely. She had this beautiful yellow silk suit on, and she came up to me. She said, oh, I'm so excited about your show. She said, what are you going to perform? And I said, well, we'll do Love Will Keep Us Together. And, I thought, well, I don't know. I don't know what we were going to do. But anyway, she said, well, aren't you going to play The Way I Want to Touch You? And I said, no. And she said, oh, you must. That's Jerry and mine's favorite song.
Oh, no.
I went, okay, this is a pretty hip White House. So I went back to everybody. I said, okay, you know what? they liked this. Why don't we just play Muskrat Love for fun? Let's just play it and see what happens. Well, I was playing bass with one hand and singing and comping, and I was right in the front row. And the front row, right in front of me, Nancy and Henry Kissinger, and there was President and Mrs. Ford, there was Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, and there was the Prime Minister and his wife, and they were like 5 feet from me, 6 feet from me.
Right.
And so we started out, and everybody was kind of tapping along. Prince Philip seemed like he was really enjoying. He was smiling, and we were on a roll. And then we started Muskrat Love, and Henry Kissinger, I got flop sweat. I went, he hates this. And especially when the part where Daryl played the muskrat sounds, where the muskrats.
The little noises.
Yeah. Well, he looked like he wanted to be anywhere but where he was. And I remember he turned around, he and his wife both, like we're talking to the people right in back of him, saying, who the hell are these people? And when the show was over, the Prime Minister and his wife came up and congratulated us. So did Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. And, of course, the Fords. Henry was out of there so fast, I didn't even see him go. But I kind of got back to him because every time I did Muskrat Love in concert for years after that, I always dedicated it to him.
So I guess he didn't join the Captain and Tennille fan club anytime soon. No. Can I say one more thing? Yeah.
Sure.
When people want to buy tickets, you are going to pay far more than you should unless you go right to the college box office.
Okay.
And you can do it online, YCPAC, which means Yavapai College Performing Arts Center.com, and it'll take you right to what's on. Scroll to Dolly. You should not pay more than $65 for the best tickets, the top tickets, and the other ones are $35. I've had people call me, if you just put in Toni, Tennille, Hello, Dolly, and Prescott, you're going to get every Ticketmaster thing.
Right. So what's the address again? It's YCPAC?
Yeah, YC for Yavapai College, PAC for PAC, Performing Arts Center.com. And once you get there, go to Hello, Dolly.
Okay, which runs November 3rd through the 20th at Yavapai College Performing Arts Center in Prescott, Arizona.
That's right.
Thanks for the tip.
I want everybody to be able to come and enjoy at a reasonable price. So that's all I have to say.
Toni, this has been delightful. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
And finally today, we welcome back for the last time our Gen Z correspondent, Louisa Whitmore. Louisa's headed off to college and will be taking a break from U.S. Modernist Radio, but not before she gives us her take on West Hollywood's Schindler House.
I'm Louisa Whitmore, and in today's commentary segment, I want to talk about Schindler House. This house, which sits in West Hollywood, California, is 100 years old, and its design included a revolutionary open floor plan, long before open floor plans were popular, chic, and the main suggestion for any home renovation on HGTV. It was designed by Rudolf Schindler for himself and his wife Pauline, along with another couple, Clyde and Marion Chase, to share. Schindler had worked at Frank Lloyd Wright's office in Chicago, taking some inspiration from a few of Wright's modernist designs, and in 1921, Schindler decided to design the home with Clyde Chase helping build it. The thing is, it took them a while to get the permits because the city of West Hollywood was so confused by the layout and design of the building that they did not want it built. Even after Schindler had pitched and explained the design until it was accepted, the city still reserved the right to stop the construction at any time. Basically, if at any point the city reflected and went, "Oh wait, this is actually horrible, how did we let this happen?" the project would end. It didn't end, however. The construction of Schindler House was completed in May 1922, making it, as of the time of recording, 100 years old. But I haven't explained what made the city so confused and concerned by the building. Surely an open concept floor plan would be exciting, right? Well, the thing with Schindler's design was that, especially for 1922, it did not resemble any kind of house at all. There were no bedrooms, living rooms, or dining rooms. The house was designed to house 4 studios, one for each resident to work in, and a kitchen where they could share chores and communal duties. This idea could be seen a lot in later modernist homes, which is pretty cool, and it's absolutely not the part that bothers me. No living rooms? Fine with me. You can live anywhere. No dining rooms? Who cares? You can eat anywhere. But no bedrooms? Here's how the residents of Schindler House got around the whole no bedrooms thing. They slept on the roof. More specifically, they slept in specifically designed sleeping baskets, which were semi-enclosed spaces on the roof protected by a canopy to keep rain off of them, which is wonderfully innovative, but I cannot imagine living for any extended period of time in a house that you are in during the daytime, but not during the night. I just think it would feel like camping all the time. Maybe that's because I live in a very rainy area, so I may be a bit jaded. It definitely works better for the climate that the house is in. The last thing about the design I want to note is how cold and impersonal it feels. Now, I can't be entirely sure how it felt 100 years ago, how it was furnished and actually lived in, but the structure that exists today is canvas walls around a concrete slab that serves as the floor and foundation. Part of this cold feeling, well, probably most of it, comes from the way the home is staged in new photos and exhibitions. Barely any furniture and no evidence that it was a home that 4 people lived in for years. Over the years, especially more recently, the home has been the subject of exhibitions, the most recent being a 100th anniversary celebration, and present on lists of historic places. It's amazing that this example of early modernist architecture has been recognized and preserved even long after its construction, despite the fact that it was not recognized at the time.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. And by Modernist realtor Angela Roll. Want to go with us to Modernism Week in February 2023 and stay with us at the U.S. Modernist compound? Email george@usmodernist.org. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino did some heavy lifting this Modernism Week, researching dozens of guests and making me and George sound thoughtful, clever, and well-informed, even when we weren't. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another Sitting by the Pool, looking at the mountains, drinking martinis, talking architecture edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.